While Starmer may not be particularly cynical, he can be extremely mendacious and economical with the truth. Starmerism is really, to a large extent, about ensuring that Corbynism cannot recur.
When we had the compositing meeting, tried to thrash out a position on Brexit, Starmer got up and he freelanced on that quite deliberately, in order, of course, we can now say with some certainty that he knew fine well that this was all part of dismantling, undermining the leadership of Corbyn. So
I thought, well, at least, he's not from politics. He doesn't come from the same political places I come from. But at least he'll, with being a man of detail, he will rip Boris Johnson apart. But he can't even do that. And that's the biggest shock for me. The political side doesn't shock me.
For example, the Welsh Party is actively seeking to gain greater responsibility over the rule book in Wales, including over things like disciplinary procedures. There's no question about Mark Drakeford and his colleagues in the leadership wanting to do things differently from the way they're being done by the UK leadership at the moment.
Welcome, comrades, to the latest episode of Redline TV. Tonight we're taking a look at the Labour Party under Keir Starmer and where it's going. It's somewhat a work in progress, I think, or is it? He's not been very popular even amongst right-wingers because he actually doesn't deliver. He's attacking the left, right and centre, and still he doesn't deliver any good results for the Labour Party, as the local elections have shown. So we want to look at what is Starmer actually doing. Is he just a puppet of the establishment and does whatever they want? Does he have a project like Tony Blair certainly had a project of radically transforming the Labour Party, doing away with conference and replacing it with the National Policy Forum? And last not least, what should the attitude of socialists be to this Labour Party that's changed quite dramatically under Starmer since the end of Corbyn? So we want to look at all of these things, and we're starting off with a discussion on the new book that's come out by Oliver Eagleton. He is related to Terry Eagleton as his son, and we are quickly looking at a brief interview with him that's been published by Housemans. And it's quite a good interview. We're just showing a few minutes from it to get a taste of what the book is about.
There's a sort of tendency to dismiss Starmer as completely cynical, and the book, in a way, kind of really rails against that because it tries to show that he does have a fairly consistent politics that can be traced back, at least as far as his CPS days, if not further. And so I guess I'm opposed to the idea, and I was when I started writing the book, that Starmer is simply a kind of empty vessel, a chameleon who is a conduit for other people's influences and doesn't have a kind of ideological center of his own. But maybe what surprised me was that there's a difference between kind of cynicism and mendacity. And while Starmer may not be particularly cynical in that he has like real, clear beliefs and convictions, he can be extremely mendacious and economical with the truth. Starmerism is really, to a large extent, about kind of ensuring that Corbynism cannot recur, and ensuring that the elements within the party that are its, inheritors and legatees are effectively silenced and marginalized. It's also become a kind of comms machine that tries, using methods like focus groups or listening exercises or public consultations, to kind of get what some of Starmer's staffers would call the core values of the British public in focus, and then craft a message that resonates with them. But MacDonald had, I think, the wrong analysis of the Brexit conjuncture. He was, on the one hand, completely fixated with the idea that the Labour membership were kind of hardcore Remainers who couldn't be convinced to any other position. And then at the same time, and more importantly, in fact, McDonnell also thought that there was a real risk of mass defections from the parliamentary party to the formation that ultimately became Change UK. And because he was so kind of spooked by that prospect, he then poured all his energy from 2018-19 onwards into joining with Starmer to shift the position of the party towards supporting a people's vote. And that meant that, he essentially joined with the people who were determined to discredit Corbyn, discredit the leadership. He joined with them when he should have been, in the trenches defending his comrades from this onslaught. Blair was, a committed kind of neoliberal and free marketeer, and I don't think that Starmer is. I think Starmer is very insecure whenever he's asked about fiscal policy, and there was that report about him being given kind of economics for beginners tutorials by Lord Falconer. I think Starmer is first and foremost a disciplinarian, a punisher of dissidents in the party and of the activist left in general. And as a corollary of that, he's unwilling to sort of offer any kind of, any even bland or tepid version of social democracy, because that would conjure up the memory of Corbynism, and that's what needs to be sort of forgotten and repressed. His initial line that he wasn't interested in a war with the Labour left, he was simply interested in dealing with anti-Semitism, that was always false. And the ease with which he's now openly targeting people who are deemed to be too left-wing just confirms that.
You make some interesting points about Brexit. We'll get into that. Also, John McDonnell, who is accusing of not having pulled his weight and not defending his comrades. But that was interesting. Jackie, for you, what was the most surprising, interesting thing in the book for you?
Well, I have to say, I found a few things that were really, really surprising. So I want to be able to speak to more than one, really, but I'll choose out the main things for me. One was his shocking record at the DPP as DPP, because I think that was what, in a way, many people were sold on. But if you look at what he did, particularly to Black youth, and if you look at his record in terms of extradition to the US, it totally meets with the way that he's running the Labour Party now and his response to human rights. So I was also shocked about the fact that the number of people charged with rape actually went down by 14% when he was in the DPP. And the other thing that I have to say that really surprised me in a book like this, and perhaps we can come back to that, is as far as I can see, virtually all the main players are mentioned and have a place, apart from John Lansman. And actually, I found that very interesting, because when you read this book, you have to read it, I think, with the understanding that the author is very, very much in tune with the sort of Aaron Bastani, Novara media sort of politics. There's some microphone going off again here. Some complicity, that kind of level of complicity of that went on with things like the witch hunt. So I'm really interested that is so plain. And just imagine just missing out John Lansman out of this whole story.
So are you saying this is written from the same perspective as, for example, the leaked report that was written by a faction, wasn't it? That was very close to John Lansman. So they turned on some on the left, but defended others.
Yes, exactly. So I think we have to understand where this is actually coming from. But I also think the fact that John Lansman isn't included, even with a mention. So if you go to the index, he's not in there at all. There's not one mention. And I suspect that's because the story that would have to be told about John Lansman perhaps would make a lot of what he's saying perhaps a bit more complicated than it appears, including the emissions.
Yeah, it's interesting though, he does criticize John McDonnell, who for a while at least was quite close to John Lansman, but...
Exactly. But it strikes me that what he's done is really made John McDonnell take all the rap for things that we know were not just him, but were very much the playlist of John Lansman.
Yeah. Graham, anything in particular you found?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I thought it was actually a very valuable book, and I think that comrades should read it. I think they'll get a lot from it. What I got from it positively was the point Jackie made, but I want to make an addition. The extent to which Starmer had this pre-existing connection with the deep state. I hadn't realised the full extent of it, though perhaps I should have done. But I mean, that's especially surprising in view of Starmer's initial connection with sections of the far left. But I mean, we know that happens, but it's still a shock to see it. I suppose leave aside Brexit, because I've got some differences with him on Brexit. But I think that his attack on John McDonnell, I mean, let me make it clear, I've got a lot of real criticisms of John. But I think that this broad-based thing that he was just in league with Starmer, especially on Brexit, I think is just too simple. And I think that if we're going to look at John, and this isn't really about John, but I mean, I think the root of it is that he almost believed himself that he could attack the British establishment outside without taking on its faction inside the Labour Party. So John was soft, in my opinion, on the witch hunt. He was soft on open selection of the parliamentary party. And I think a lot of these errors that he points out flow from that fundamental question. We'll leave aside Brexit. I think the other thing is that perhaps he doesn't explore sufficiently, what I hope we're going to explore today, is the comparison with Blairism. Because I think there's a lot. I mean, each was a counter-revolution against a previous left-wing kind of leadership. Blairism, the response to Bennism, and Starmer, the counter-revolution to Jeremy. And I think we want to look at those comparisons, but also see the differences, because as Oliver points out, he's far from secure, Starmer. And I think that makes him in some ways a more dangerous opponent of the party itself, because I think he's threatening the very existence of the party. And perhaps that doesn't fully come out. But having said all of that, I think it's a valuable book, and it really does bear a lot of reading.
So when you say he's challenging the whole existence of the party, that's by attacking the members, attacking the trade unions. How would you describe what he's doing?
Look, Blair also attacked the trade unions, not so much inside the party, but I mean, he attacked workers in struggle. And that's exactly what Starmer's doing. But he's sidelined the unions. But above all, he's closed down debate in the party. He's shutting down parties. He's expelling members. He's suspending members. And we're going to see in other interviews, I hope, that this has gone to a new level. I'm not saying at all, in fact, the contrary, that the party is beyond repair, but it has reached the stage where there really is a threat to the party. And I think that perhaps that hasn't come out sufficiently in Oliver's book.
Before I bring in Jackie, I'm sorry, I have to inform comrades, we had to switch off the chat. There's been a few people come onto the chat who seem to have cloned other people's login details. So there's 2 or 3 with the same name, so we can't just remove people who are posting rubbish in the chat. So as to not to distract everybody with nonsense in the chat and silly people on video, we've just had to switch it off, I'm afraid. That's not usually what we're doing. We're trying to keep a horizontal debate going, but unfortunately a few people can make that quite difficult. So Jackie, Oliver Eagleton says Starmer is making sure that something like Corbynism can never happen again. I know they've already changed the rules of the leadership election, which actually parts of the left supported, which is quite a stupid thing to do. What else? What other measures is he introducing?
Well, of course, he's actually, I mean, the interesting thing about this book, if you read it, is that you see he's treating the Labour Party very much the way he treated his department when he was in the DPP. So he's seeing this as a bureaucratic process. He's not interested in democracy or the way the democratic process works. He's not interested in free speech. You can see that in the way he treated the MPs who attempted to sign the letter, questioning NATO. Now, that was an unprecedented thing to do, because normally what happens in parties is we see them as diverse places. He doesn't see that. I think there's somebody trying to do this on purpose.
Just carry on.
So he sees this as something where he is the director and he is not going to allow any other diverse opinion. So we're also seeing the really high amount control. And of course, there's always been some on the selection process. So not just the selection process, but you've now got this issue of, these are the people who, this is a pool that you can select from. And a number of those are people who 3 years ago were Tory. But you've also got the fact that they are now going to parachute people into local councils to so-called reorganize them, and so on and so on. And without doubt, and this is also, I think, what is petrifying the Socialist Campaign Group. He is doing it by saying, if you don't follow the line, you are out. Exactly the same message he's doing on members. But, I don't want to just leave it there, because there is a cost. And that cost is to the Labour Party, not just to the left.
Of course, and the Labour Party is, if we like it or not, at the moment still the biggest, representation for working class people with the affiliation of the unions. We're getting to that issue a bit later. So it is not just annoying, it is a tragedy for the working class. So Starmer is not as dramatic, though, as Blair, isn't he, in terms of, Blair came in and he had a plan and he knew what he was going to do. He axed conference, basically, sidelined it totally from decision-making. He outsourced decision-making, policy-making, program-making to the National Policy Forum, taken it away from members. Conference since then has been an empty shell, really. If only Corbyn had been as ruthless in his plans. But Graham, what are the similarities and key differences with Blair?
I think I've already tried to indicate that. I think actually, in terms of the right-wing ideology and practice, moving the party to become a safe for capital for the establishment, that's obviously what unites them. I think what separates them is only the situation in which they find themselves in. Starmer has come to the leadership of the party in a much less secure way. I think that he's already alienated the membership by attacking it in a way that Blair actually in some ways didn't do. He had the passive support of a lot of the membership, or some of the membership and some of the unions, for the simple reason that he delivered election victories. And after all those years of Tory rule, that was a relief to people. It was dreadful. In some ways, Blair was worse, because who knows, but not sure at all that Starmer would have done what Blair did on Iraq. But the lack of security, the extremity of the crisis, the economic crisis in this country, means that the conflict with with having an open membership, with the affiliation with the unions, is potentially more acute. I think it's too early to say the extent of that difference, but I mean, you know, this is something that which I hope will come out in the rest of the discussion.
Sure.
And then there's the Brexit issue, but
I was just going to ask you about that, because I could see when Oliver Eagleton was talking about Starmer and McDonnell working together on Brexit, you don't quite agree with that, do you?
Here, is it my bad etiquette on Zoom? I usually go, oh my God. Look, I just think there's a certain common sense on the left that says Labour lost the 2019 election because of the second referendum. Now, there's some truth in that, but it's far too simple. To me, Corbyn, McDonnell, the whole of the left was in a bind. We were between a rock and a hard place. And it's too simple to say that, because if you look at Eagleton's book, he points out actually what the alternative was. And the alternative was supporting Theresa May before Johnson came to the leadership in putting forward some kind of soft Brexit. Now, there's an argument to say they should have done that, but I'll tell you, if Labour had actually been responsible in getting Theresa May, a Tory government's soft Brexit through, there would have been a lot of squealing from the left, including from people probably like me. So they were the alternatives. I think, look, given the situation that Brexit was still going to be the major factor in the 2019 election, Labour was really, really in difficulties. And there was a real incoherence in Labour's position. No one really knew what they stood for. And in effect, we fell between two stools. I'll be very interested to see what Alan says about this, but we fell between two stools. I'll be quite honest. I had a useless position on Brexit. I had the worst of all worlds. I was an abstainer. I couldn't stand either the Remain position or the Brexit position.
I think that's a pretty good position, actually.
Well, it's also pretty useless. It may have been good for my conscience, but it was pretty useless in practice. And so, you know, but that, I think Labour was between a rock and a hard place, and just as simply, I think it was sort of the Lotto leader of the opposition's office position is to say, well, it was all John McDonnell and all of this. And as I say, I've got real criticisms of John, which I've expressed, but I think this is just too simplistic. And I had some reservations about Oliver's position, which is parroting the Lotto's position on Brexit. I think that we were really in a very difficult position, and that had we gone the other way, we would have then lost some southern seats, and we would have been in difficulties either way.
We've got to move on now. I think the problem was that Corbyn accepted there's only yes or no answer. There's the EU and then there's British capitalism. When instead, if he could have developed a positive vision of a workers' Europe, for example, and, you know, argue that case, no attempt was made at all. So it was accepted, you either have to vote this or this, and that really wasn't. There was no alternative at all, so you couldn't.
Let me just say this: I think there was an insufficient attempt. But say there was no attempt isn't right. There were the Labour red lines and all of this. It wasn't developed sufficiently, and I think it did get waylaid. But I think this is a really complex discussion.
It is, and we're bringing in now Alan Simpson to this, and we have to take a back seat now because. Jackie is talking.
Yeah, hi Alan, just before I start speaking to Alan, I just want to remind you, especially as we seem to have some saboteurs with us, which I think just actually tells you that we're beginning to be really quite effective because they don't want people to hear us. We really do need your money. That's as simple as it gets, really. We need to get to a point where we are self-sufficient. Please have a look. Support us on Patreon. You can pay little or you can pay a lot, but please keep this work going. Okay, Alan, good evening. Nice to see you.
Hello, Jackie.
Hi. Can we start off with Brexit, as that's what we were speaking about? Do you want to have a comment on this issue about what happened? between Corbyn and Starmer about Brexit. How do you read what happened with that?
Well, I was never really drawn into the Jeremy Starmer stuff. My work was primarily with John and Jeremy, and I have to say, although John and I had several disagreements over the years, I don't see him as the villain of the piece at all. And at that time, over the Brexit stuff, I was doing quite a lot of work with European comrades on the left, and was getting some really strong messages that the Lexit proposals were regarded with derision in Europe. They were just seen, they said that if Labour came in asking for support for Lexit, there isn't a single one on the left in Europe who would actually support it. It's a bad joke and you're just kidding yourself. Now, I actually drafted the outline of a speech for Jeremy in advance of the Lisbon conference that he went to. And it was trying to feed in some of those ideas about a workers' Europe, about what a workers' and climate stable Europe might look like, essentially around the forming of an ecological commonwealth. And Jeremy seemed really keen on the ideas when we went through them in Portcullis House, and he went to Lisbon, and not a single one of those points ended up in the speech that he made. And it seemed to me that Jeremy couldn't get past his own gatekeepers, and that for me was the greatest obstacle in the setup that we had. John wasn't the problem. For me, it was located much more around Jeremy's own inner circle, to whom he was very loyal. And to be fair, they had been very loyal to him in the earliest days, which were horrendous. But they were also a real block, I think, in developing the basis upon which he was able then to go out and move with the party into a more coherent internationalist position that we never ended up occupying. So that was my take on that. And I think for me, John tried to hold things together. That leadership was best when John and Jeremy were in the same room making the decisions. All the problems seemed to come when the staff set about trying to make sure that the two of them were actually in different places, and often John was cut out of the loop. So that was where Brexit was.
Okay, so let's actually think now about this, what would be called the transition from the kind of Corbyn style of leadership to the Starmer style of leadership. What do you think have been the main points of change there? And how do you see the parliamentary party on the left as having coped with that?
Okay, Jackie, let me roll it back a bit further, because I think what I want to do is to try and look at the position of the left vis-a-vis where we were under Blair and where we are under Starmer.
Fine.
Because, Blair was a consummate populist, and he knew what he was doing. He knew the more liberalized and individualized economics that he was in pursuit of. But he came across as the sort of person that lots of constituents said, if you knocked on the door, you'd feel okay about saying, oh, come in and have a cup of tea. With Starmer, you look through the letterbox and think, oh, shall I bother? No, probably not at all. He has the misfortune of actually having less charisma than the letterbox. And this is a real problem for Labour in the situation that we are now in, because, at the time of the sort of Blair succession and the campaign in the run-up to 97, there was a genuine uptick on the streets and in communities, and this notion that things could only get better if we had a Labour government. You don't find that now, and people in a sense, if they are drawn to Labour, it's either out of loyalty or the sense that, Boris's lot are so corrupt and so wretched that there has to be anything is a better alternative. But that's not a convincing position to be in. And what scares me most is that I no longer know where the parliamentary left is. I've tried to ask, where the campaign group are and what the positions they're taking. And it seems to be, the sort of politics of purdah, that you cannot find leadership that is emerging that provides the platform for left ideas, radical transformative ideas that we still had in that 97 Parliament. Now, lots of us were regularly getting bollocking for breaking the whip, but it was never withdrawn. There was lots of talk about in the PLP and calls for us to be thrown out, but it never proceeded. And what you have now is, as you were saying earlier, that Tina points out that there's never been a situation where MPs were told if they signed a certain EDM, they would lose the whip. And this is the politics of silencing that is really scary. And so everyone on the campaign group who put their names to that EDM all backed off collectively. This is a very, very dangerous position to be in, because it isn't as though outside Parliament there's any sense of coherence about what Labour would stand for as a vision in the run into the next election. We had one other comparison which was really interesting at post-97, about 3 months after Professor John Curtis came in and did a presentation to Labour MPs, which stopped a lot of people in their tracks, because he said they'd done really detailed exit polling of people who had switched and voted Labour, and the outcomes were really interesting. They had an overwhelming sense of identifying with Blair, the young, fresh, outward-looking, inclusive Labour Party, as an alternative to these rotten, horrid, corrupt Tories who just, squirreled money into their own pockets and ruined everything. So there was a big, uptick on that. But then they asked people, well, exactly what policies they thought New Labour would introduce. And Curtis had done a complete mix of Blair's policies and John Smith's policies. And the outcome was something like almost a 90% correlation between people who thought they voted for Blair the person and John Smith the agenda. So
that's interesting, isn't it? Because that's a reminder, in a way, about the complex way in which the electorate works, and also, of course, the way it's sort of projected by the media then. But we have an issue, haven't we, here with Starmer, where what he seems to be doing is to try and out-Tory the Tories while being outflanked, for example, on issues like welfare. And it seems to me that the Tories are just working up to giving a better offer in terms of a windfall tax. This is what they're building up to. So it leaves Labour actually in a very vulnerable position, doesn't it?
It does. And in a way, I think New Labour, that mentality, milked as much as you could get out of the notion of arm's length interventionism. I mean, Gordon Brown did this, the idea of putting things out to private tender for lots of public services and doing it as an off-balance sheet accounting process, which worked for a time until that was ruled to be invalid and all those debts had to be put back onto the public accounts. Whoever comes in now won't have that leeway.
No.
And in any case, the nature of the economy has changed. And I've just done a piece just analysing the fact that, in the sense, the dispute period that I think we're entering into, the conflict period, isn't being driven by trade unions, workers flexing their muscles and having excess power to demand and drive wage increases that drive inflation. Actually, all the inflation is in asset price inflation, that it's the concentration, colossal increase in the acquisition of wealth, and on the same line, the increasing numbers of people in abject poverty. So there is no space for that illusion to be rerun. And redistributive economics is going to be the only name of the game. And post-growth economics are going to have to be the name of the game, neither of which Starmer seems to grasp. And I think the public, large swathes of the public know this. The kids in the climate movement know that the idea of more growth, more production, more consumption is just a suicide run. And they're not going to come with us. The people who believe Jeremy, when he talked about transformative change, aren't going to run with Keir's half-expelled Labour Party. But
can I ask you something? How can we get back to the Labour Party to a situation like that? What can the left do in the Labour Party? And could we get somebody, obviously not Corbyn, Richard Bergen perhaps, though he's been quite quiet, but, where's the space to fight for somebody who will fight for, a socialist vision of the future?
Well, I think the starting point for me would be to say collectively, if you look at the context that you are able to draw on now, how can you create an interface, a supportive interface with what remains of the Socialist Campaign Group? Because I think they need to feel that they're not isolated and marooned in there. That would be the starting point. Then to work out a programme of the terrain upon which they can fight both inside Parliament that would get support, organised support, outside and around the country. So that's where I would start. I'm surprised that they haven't collectively already gone to see Keir in relation to the EDM debacle, because if they were, for instance, to go and say to him, look, this is so over the top that we're not going to do it again. We've given you the breathing space once. We won't do it again. And if you want to remove the whip from all of us, just bear in mind that is the platform upon which an anti-Labour, genuinely left set of independent candidates are going to run in safe Labour seats in the next election. And if you want to lose all the seats that you have, go ahead, but don't expect to end up running the country. And I think that has to somehow, Starmer has to be faced out privately on that to see how catastrophic it would be. But if people just retreat into their own little cubby hole,
there's nowhere to go.
Absolutely.
There's absolutely. Thank you very much, Alan, for that. As always, very informative. Thank you, Alan.
Okay.
Okay, we're now going on to think about the situation in Scotland and in Wales. So, Mike, first of all, Mike, we're just about to look at the situation in Scotland. I know for me that I have a number of contacts in Scotland and I visit Scotland reasonably regularly and get to talk to people, but I'm also really aware that certainly in the rest of the United Kingdom, there's not a lot of familiarity with what's happened and happening in Scotland. So can we just first go back a bit, which is Richard Leonard was elected, but before that, what kind of state was the Labour Party in Scotland in? So if you could go back there quite briefly and then take us up to Richard Leonard, that would be handy.
Could you perhaps introduce Mike quickly and tell us who he is?
Oh my gosh.
Shall I quickly
can you, please?
I'll recognise some comrades here, but I'm a member in Edinburgh Northern Leith, where I sit on the executive committee and I sit on a Further Education Lecturers Union National Committee as well. Those are as far as my credentials go, comrades. So It's a tragedy, to be honest, Jackie, because the history of the Labour Party, of course, begins in Scotland with Keir Hardie, and its degeneration in Scotland probably begins around about the same time. I know that those who supported the Blair project are very big on his electoral success, and they point to that as his key kind of achievement. But as we know, from 97 onwards, that vote began to collapse, and collapse very quickly, particularly in working class areas. And it was only the calamitous state of the Tory party that really kept us afloat in many ways. Similar things have been happening in Scotland. We did, subsequent to devolution, win the first two elections to the Scottish Parliament and governed along with the Liberal Democrats. But it was clear, and it's consistent with some of the things that people are saying, although we legislated for devolution, we had no real sense, either at a UK level or in Scotland, what to do with devolution, because we didn't have an ideological project in mind. And it was just another platform to pursue managerialist politics. And the SNP did have a platform, did have a vision. And although they initially were reluctant to get involved in the devolution project, they quickly saw how it could be exploited for their own ends. Now, I should say to comrades down south who may have illusions in the SNP that they are a neoliberal outfit, a small c conservative outfit, but have been extremely effective at using devolution as a platform for nationalist politics. And we have lost an awful lot of people electorally and from the party to the nationalists, because they have been very effective at framing themselves as the radical alternative to a Labour Party that drifted very much to the right.
So how did Richard Leonard, tell us something about, just again, very briefly, about Richard Leonard's politics. Sure. What was his politics?
He came from a trade union background. He was a full-timer in the GMB. He was very clearly and firmly on the left, and he was the left candidate. The organised left in Scotland got behind his candidacy. He beat Anna Sawar, the current leader right now. And similar to events down south when Jeremy won, that was a democratic decision that the right could not live with. And I think you're going to see a couple of interviews where leading comrades who were in around that ecology saw up close,
yes,
just how far in subverting his leadership they were prepared to go, because, as I say, they did not accept the legitimacy of a left leadership in Scotland.
Yeah, and I found that very sad, because I actually had a meeting with Richard Leonard up in Edinburgh, and he was, as you say, a very really nice person, a really nice, sincere person. But we're going to have a watch of those videos now. First of all, we're going to see Tommy Kane, who was a Corbyn advisor in Scotland. And then we're going to have a little video from Neil Findlay, who was the Brexit spokesman for the Scottish Labour Party. And then we'll chat again, Mike.
Well, my role was Scottish advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. He treated Scotland as a priority. He understood the importance of trying to win Scotland back in order to get the Labour Party back into power.
Through that time, what did you see and observe in terms of subterfuge, sabotage, or a lack of support for Corbyn?
What I encountered was an office, was a movement that was full of enthusiasm, that was brimming with ideas and policies that would help transform the country. It was fully passionate, it was full of ability, contrary to what many people might say and commentate on retrospectively. They weren't trained in the way that the right have always trained themselves, thinking that they are groomed for high office. In a sense, we weren't. We don't. We're activists. We get out there and we agitate, and we try to educate, and we try to persuade. We don't train ourselves to be wannabe politicians. So for a lot of people, it was a steep learning curve. But I think, ultimately, eventually, we all stepped up to the mark, and I think we ended up having quite a cohesive organisation and operation. And I think it's really important to say that, because of course that's against a context of hostility, of collusion, plans being hatched all over the place, and campaigns being organised against the democratically elected leader of the party. We had this schism, if you like, dual kind of atmosphere going on, one full of hope, full of passion, brimming with ideas, and on the other hand, every single day having to deal with the latest attack on Jeremy, the latest smear, the latest lie, the latest undermining. And I say this, I don't say this lightly, I've never came across a more arrogant, conceited, entitled, nasty bunch of people than I've found in the Parliamentary Labour Party. Nobody was working collegiately, constructively about holding the SNP or the Tories to account. It was all about trying to regain power within the Labour Party. It was all about thinking to themselves that the left leading the party north and south of the border was an aberration that had to be sorted. And actually we see that now with Starmer. Starmer's not going after anybody other than the left in the party. They see that the right in the party, dealing with the left inside the party is the first priority before they get on to anything else. And that was kind of done in reverse when you had left leaderships where they thought we need to get this sorted before we can do anything else. But Jeremy kept Starmer in because of his inclusive nature and because he was seeking to keep the party together. And that's where we ended up with this fudge on, which I think is a constructive ambiguity, I think we called it at the time. This fudge on Brexit that really pissed people off, and it's well documented. We all know what took place at conference, I think 2018 conference, when we had the compositing meeting that went on for hours. Starmer came up, got up and delivered his speech where he said, oh, and yes, he spoke about a referendum and Remain being on the ballot paper. That final line, which was never agreed by anyone, never agreed by the leader's office, was certainly never agreed at the composite meeting the night before. And he said that he freelanced on that quite deliberately in order, of course, we can now say with some certainty that he knew fine well that this was all part of dismantling, undermining the leadership of Corbyn. So he was on manoeuvres, I think, for quite some time. He did resign in 2016. So he did resign. He was part of the chicken coup. So, I think it's important to remember, and we should have all been suspicious of the fact that he did come back and he did present this veneer of loyalty. Jeremy got him in because, kept him in because, unlike Starmer himself, he sought to keep the party together. The Brexit position ultimately ended up being that position on the basis that Jeremy was trying to hold the party together because he knew that there was large swathes of the party that supported Remain, that did want another referendum, which I always thought was mad. It's a bit like 2014 here in Scotland. Imagine Scotland voted yes, and then Parliament then tried to block Scottish independence. People would have been on the streets. They would have been literally on the streets. So it's understandable that people got so angry and got so pissed off and took it out on us at the ballot box in the general election in 2019.
Do you want to just describe what you observed as in the kind of weeks and months after Richard Leonard was elected?
Yeah.
How it kind of coincided and was maybe the Scottish equivalent of the kind of things that were going on with Corbyn down south?
I suppose the attacks and the undermining of Richard Leonard started actually before he was even elected. I think it was the morning he was elected. Kezia Dugdale announced that she was going into the jungle. I am a celebrity, get me out of here. And I don't think there's any coincidence that announcement was timed for the morning of Richard being declared the leader. The dark arts were at play at that time. He handed me the Brexit spokesperson job in Scotland. That's your mates for you, I suppose. But I also was the party business manager in Parliament, effectively the party whip. That meant that I dealt with a lot of the machinations in the parliamentary group. Far from joyful. One thing we did say to him was, please do not make all the mistakes that Jeremy made. And by that, I mean trying to operate a big tent policy. Let's all work together. Let's bring all the people who really want to get rid of you into the camp, hold them tight, and we'll all work together. We saw that counterproductive approach when Jeremy was leading at Westminster, and the people who he tried to work with turned against him viciously. There was an air of inevitability that would happen in Scotland, and I would suggest at times it happened even more viciously. However, Richard was his own man, and he decided to do what he did against the advice of many of us. But it was relentless. It was week in, week out, day in, day out. They would find every minor issue would become a battle, things being blown out of proportion. I mean, at one point I said we should just invite the press into our group meetings because it would save people the bother of having to tweet them what was being said. There was times when we were in those group meetings and, certain journalists who they like to feed stories to had tweeted the story before we had left the room, and I don't exaggerate when I say that. And of course, some of these are people who, believed that all we needed to do was go back to them running the party and somehow we would, march to triumph, when actually they'd been central figures in the long-term decline of the Scottish Labour Party, yet we were supposed to believe that they had the magic elixir to fix it, and it just became brutal. And it was very much similar to Jeremy. Richard Leonard's a decent man who made wrong decisions, and a thoroughly decent man with good principles, a genuine socialist who believes in the cause. I dealt with Starmer quite closely during that period over Brexit. I actually got on very well with him. I found him to be someone who was completely on top of his brief, and even when he was putting across the rather, the complex position that Labour had. That's why I'm so surprised, frankly, how badly he's performing as leader of the opposition, because I thought, well, at least, he's not from my politics. He doesn't come from the same political place as I come from, but at least he'll, with being a man of detail, he will rip Boris Johnson apart, but he can't even do that. And that's the biggest shock for me. The political side doesn't shock me, but the fact that he's not even able to, on a week-to-week basis, tear apart the worst Prime Minister and one of the worst Commons performers you will ever see, I find quite astonishing.
I mean, I think what strikes me there is how similar that story is to what's certainly happened in England, and the outrage that you want to feel about their audacity and their dishonesty is just profound. And the description of Richard being, a decent man who made a few wrong decisions, a lot of them around actually allowing people who were political enemies to come too close. And that is, I think, very similar to the way we feel about Corbyn. But okay, we are where we are now. You've got a different leader of the Scottish Party who, as far as I can see, is kind of similar, maybe richer than Starmer. So where now for Scotland?
We've just had the local government elections, as you know, Jackie, and again, similar to Starmer, the primary appeal of Anas was that he's a professional politician. He will polish up the party. He will drag it back to the centre ground where everyone is supposedly, and he will make us electable again. But the strategy up here has been so far to peel away unionist voters who are primarily, conservative voters, and to appeal to them on the basis that we are the most plausible unionist party as the Tories, implode. That has borne some fruit. There's been a moderate improvement, wildly overstated by Anas, of course, in their results at the local government elections. But that card is maxed out. There's only so many Tory voters to pull back to the Labour Party, and of course you have to triangulate towards them to appeal to them, which in fact suits the agenda, of course, of Anas.
Okay, sorry about that, because I think it's really worthwhile to get these different views from around the country, and we can see how coordinated this was. But I think now, Tina, you're going to be talking about Wales.
Yeah, Darren Williams was speaking to us earlier in the week, to me and Graham Bash. And actually, if you look at the results of the local elections that Starmer celebrated, most of them are actually in Wales, where, of course, Starmer doesn't have much influence at all, where Mark Drakeford is leading the party, who's a Corbyn supporter and was much to the left of Starmer. So we've spoke to him about a few of these issues.
Darren, you're a member of Welsh Labour Executive, a member of Welsh Labour Grassroots, and as most of our viewers will know, an ex-member of Labour's NEC. Now, we've seen in the last couple of years the Starmer-Evans counter-revolution taking its toll in the Labour Party, expulsions, suspensions, loss of members, closing down of discussion, attendance at CLP meetings massively down, imposition of candidates for elections, and poor election results too. What's the position in Wales? There's not a Starmerite leadership there. Has the impact been different? If so, why?
It's been different in some respects. I mean, it's the same to the extent that the Welsh Party doesn't have any devolved control over the rule book and over disciplinary procedures. I mean, it does have control over things like selections for the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament, local government and so on. But as far as the disciplinary process is concerned, it's the same in Wales as anywhere else. Where things are different, I think, is the kind of political direction of the Welsh Party and to some extent the political culture of Welsh Labour. Now, I should say, you know, we have our own issues. There is a democratic deficit in some respects in Welsh Labour, as there is in the wider UK party. That's something we've been trying to address. So Welsh Labour Grassroots is sort of initiative. We got a Welsh Labour Democracy Review established at conference in 2018, and that is now coming to a conclusion. So very much modelled on the UK Labour Democracy Review that we saw when Jeremy was leader. So we're attempting to address some of those things. And our leader, Mark Drakeford, you know, is very sympathetic to that. And on his initiative, we have seen some positive changes. I think the fact that the leadership in Wales is different has kept a lot of people in the party in Wales who might otherwise have left because of the issues that we've seen with Starmer's leadership.
Has Mark Drakeford distanced himself from Starmer?
I think Mark's approach is more to focus on the positives as far as what Welsh Labour is doing. He hasn't sought kind of confrontation, if you like, with the UK party leadership. So he's kind of played that down publicly. But I mean, there's no question that, you know, he is unhappy with the extent to which there has been this attack on activists on the left. The Welsh Party is actively seeking to gain greater responsibility over the rule book in Wales, including over things like disciplinary procedures. There's no question about, you know, Mark Drakeford and his colleagues in the leadership wanting to do things differently from the way they're being done by the UK leadership at the moment. And
that's been reflected in the election results, hasn't it?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, I think with the local election results, it's quite striking that out of, I think, the 108 net gains in council seats that Labour secured across England, Wales and Scotland, 66 of those were in Wales. That result is to some degree a reflection of the general popularity of the Welsh Labour government. And we saw it in the Senedd elections, the Welsh Parliament elections last year, where, you know, against the background of fairly lacklustre results across the rest of Britain, Welsh Labour did very well. It was one of the best results the party had had. And I think a lot of that reflects the approach that the Welsh Labour government had taken, particularly in response to the COVID pandemic, where there was a much more robust commitment to people's health and well-being and a willingness to challenge the Tory government in Westminster.
You've been around some time and you go back as far as the Blair years.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how you see the comparison between Starmer and Blair. What's the similarities and where's the differences?
I actually think that things are considerably worse now than they were in the Blair era, and I never thought I would say that. I mean, as you know, it was a struggle for many of us to hang on in the party at the time of the invasion of Iraq, and where the UK party was actively promoting privatisation in public services, and you know, Mandelson's infamous quote about being intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich and so on. And yeah, I actually look back now almost with maybe fondness is an overstatement, but certainly it seems in some ways relatively benign. I mean, Blair ideologically obviously had a clear agenda that was about promoting neoliberalism, and we don't see that explicitly from Starmer. But I think there's two things. So one is that whatever else you say about Blair, at least he knew what he was doing and he was able to deliver it. I think part of the problem with Starmer is just the sheer incompetence of it. There doesn't seem to be any clear program or agenda at all. To the second point, which is that I think actually Blair was more tolerant of dissent than Starmer is. I mean, there were some high-profile cases. So, you know, the left MEPs, Ken Coates and Hugh Kerr, were expelled. Liz Davis tried to stand in Leeds North East, I think it was, and she was basically stopped. And of course, there were the stitch-ups. So there was the stitch-up of Ken Livingstone in London, the first time he ran for mayor. There was the stitch-up of Rhodri Morgan in Wales. But actually, I think there were relatively few expulsions and suspensions of people on the left. I think what Blair did was, he changed the rule book. So he took away conferences' sovereign role in policy making and diverted all of that through the National Policy Forum. And he largely kind of just sidestepped and marginalized the left rather than taking the left on and kind of battering them all the time. Starmer has been more vindictive and more hostile and more draconian in his approach than the worst of our previous leaders in living memory, frankly. Yeah, he seems not to be able to please anybody, really. There's a very narrow band of people, including, some rather strange cheerleaders like Paul Mason, unfortunately. But the people who are actively enthusiastic about Starmer, I think, are relatively few in number. I mean, there's all this stuff now about, is Wes Streeting the saviour? I mean, if Wes Streeting is the answer, then people are asking the wrong questions, frankly. Clearly what we need is a change in political direction in the party. We need a leader who is going to present a clear alternative vision to the Tories and give them hope that we can do something different instead of just trying to be slightly less corrupt and slightly more efficient than the Tories.
What do you say, Darren, to those tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands who have just left the party in despair and are looking for alternatives outside of Labour? What's your message to them?
I sympathise with those people. I understand why they have left the party. And of course, in some cases, it was involuntary, those who were thrown out, including yourself, tragically. Unfortunately, I think we have to look at the realities of, the British political system and British political culture and how conservative and inflexible it is. And, I've long been an advocate of proportional representation. I think that's it's only one, but it's one of the key changes that need to happen. I think people who do choose to leave need to be realistic about the scope for an alternative. And I just don't think, certainly at a UK, at a Westminster level, I don't think that alternative is available to them. So for all the terrible problems that the Labour Party has at the moment, I think that socialists need to be in there and need to keep fighting. And, we're not fighting on ground that we would have chosen at the moment, but I think we have to do what we can. There are things that can be achieved, but in the long run, we have to take the whole party back for an authentic socialist agenda and real democracy. And, I know that's a lot to get from where we are now, but I would just, really encourage people to try and do that. And for those of us who have lived through the Blair era and saw the party, embarking on illegal invasions of foreign countries and, actively privatizing public services and celebrating inequality, we've been through this kind of situation before. We've just got to, commit ourselves to the struggle, really, and try and win things back.
How do you see the changes that are perhaps been introduced in terms of the trade union link? I mean, Starmer is not only attacking the membership, but he seems to have very little interest in the trade unions. But also some of the trade unions have very little interest in the Labour Party anymore. Would that change the character of the Labour Party quite dramatically?
That's a very interesting question, and I don't pretend to have a definitive answer. But we've seen some really interesting developments. I think particularly the result of the Unite General Secretary election, and what that means as far as the kind of step away from active engagement in Labour politics, but nevertheless an unwillingness to tolerate open provocations to the unions. I think that is interesting and significant, and we'll have to see how that plays out. I think it tells you a lot that we've had two long-standing Labour affiliates in recent weeks debate motions to disaffiliate from the party. I'm glad that they decided not to take that road, but we've already seen the Bakers Union disaffiliate, under intense provocation with their president suspended and so on. So I I think really things are up in the air as far as the unions are concerned. But I think history suggests that it's an unwise Labour leader who consistently antagonises leading trade unions. And I think that could come back to bite him, along with some of the other rash decisions that he's made.
Welcome to Pete Firmin from the Labour Representation Committee. We want to talk to you a little bit more about this last issue that we were talking about with Darren Williams, which is the trade union link. Do you see any sort of qualitative changes that are happening? Say, for example, with Sharon Graham, who's taken a huge step back from political involvement with the Labour Party. The FBU has been discussing disaffiliation. I know it was defeated, but there are a few other unions who are discussing these issues. Is it the same as it's always been, or has there been a bit of a qualitative change in your view?
I'm not convinced there is a great change, quantitative change. I mean, if you take discussion at union conferences, in my union, the CWU, there's been a motion on disaffiliation of the Labour Party probably every conference the last 20 years. The margin at ASLEF conference last week for keeping affiliation was greater than the last time they discussed it. So we have to take slightly with a pinch of salt rather than sort of think every time a union is discussing it, great, it's going to disaffiliate or something. On Sharon Graham, I have mixed feelings. I mean, what she's doing in terms of disputes and winning pay increases is great. And, not before time that this was done, and especially with the rising cost of living. But her attitude towards the Labour Party is almost, in some ways, it's apolitical. She says, we're not going to accept things, blah, blah, blah. But she also doesn't want to actually get involved in the way that, unions can and should get involved. And that sort of, that plows into that sort of, well, the union shouldn't really get involved in politics approach, which isn't actually a socialist approach at all. And there's always been there in a lot of unions, there's always been a layer of why are we involved in politics?
And of course, the history of the Labour Party, I mean, is very closely linked with the trade unions. I mean, I'm from Germany, for example, where it was the Labour movement that set up the trade unions. But of course, here it was quite the opposite, wasn't it? Can you explain that to people who are maybe not so familiar with it?
I mean, the crucial difference here, and I think the Australian Labour Party is the only other social democratic party in the world which is similar, is that unions can have delegates at every level of the party, at CLPs, at regions, at national, whereas in parties like the German party, the French party, etc., there's sort of, they talk to each other at the party and the unions talk to each other at national level, but there isn't that link at every level of the party, and that's a crucial difference. And I think that's why, in some cases, those other social democratic parties have almost disappeared, like France and Greece, because there isn't that solid base in the working class that the unions provide. Now that comes with all sorts of problems. I'm not saying it's one-sided great, but it does provide that base that some of the parties haven't had. And yes, it was the unions that formed the party here, basically saying, I mean, especially after various legal judgments against unions over strikes, saying liberals, who some unions supported up to then, weren't representing the interests of the working class, and we're breaking and forming our own party. Interestingly, Blair said at one stage explicitly that split from the Liberals was a mistake, and he explicitly talked about breaking the link with unions. He never followed it through. As far as I'm aware, Starmer hasn't said anything similar. We might think what he's doing might drive the unions away, but he hasn't actually said anything as explicit as Blair did.
Do you think it's understandable that unions like the RMT or the bakers have made that break? Is there? I mean, it's a bit like a lot of members leaving now, isn't it? They are demoralized.
It's understandable, but I mean, for one thing, it's uncoordinated. So, a union breaking off on its own doesn't really achieve or change much. And also, I mean, the FBU split totally understandably, although I think wrongly, when the party was attacking it over its pay fight many years ago. But it didn't go anywhere politically. It didn't decide to stand candidates or to support somebody else or anything like that. So, I mean, I think if a union or group of unions, in my preference, were to disaffiliate, it should be on a clear political basis rather than just, we don't like what Starmer's doing. And I mean, even on the Bakers, who, you know, I have a lot of time for quite a few people in the leadership and understand why they left. It's interesting that even in the run up to them leaving, when they'd essentially decided to leave, their leading people were not willing to speak on platforms with people who'd been expelled or suspended from the party, which was very odd, but was in fact the case. And we think back, seeing John Dunn here reminded me, the miners' strike of 84-85, when Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader, was seen as a super scab, as far as I'm aware, the NUM didn't discuss disaffiliating from the party. More often than not, the unions go along with, reluctantly or otherwise, what the party leadership is doing. Now, that's a task for socialists to tackle within their unions as well as the party. But it's an unfortunate fact. I mean, Blair in the end basically decided he didn't need to break the link because the unions were, you know, going along with what he did. And Starmer maybe hoping that that's the case. That, I mean, certainly unions are divided. I mean, on the NEC, you know, roughly half the union delegates go along with Starmer and roughly half oppose things he's doing. But he may be hoping that eventually the unions will just shut up and go along with whatever he does.
Pete, I haven't got much to ask you because I'm totally on the same page as you. I mean, it struck me that some of our comrades on the left got a little excited when the Bakers disaffiliated. And I think I always thought that that was totally over the top and that it didn't represent necessarily that much, though we were sympathetic. Do you see kind of unions disaffiliating individually rather than as part of a collective action, similar to individual members leaving for the most understandable reasons, but in an atomized way? Because I take the view that if we're ever going to build or rebuild Labour or build an alternative, if that really comes to it, it's got to be through the same collective action, both members and unions, that created the Labour Party. And if we're going to ever recreate it, it's got to be us acting collectively together, not in an atomised individual way. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, even those left unions that aren't on the verge of disaffiliating, they have to coordinate much more closely on opposing the things that Starmer is doing now. I mean, to give a classic example, I think virtually all of the unions supported the TUC motion that Israel is an apartheid state. Yet none of the unions, I think I'm right in saying none of the unions, have been willing to openly challenge the attack on people's claims on anti-Semitism. And you know, we have to push that if they're serious about their support for the Palestinians and the description of Israel, then they should be challenging Starmer openly on issues like that, but not just that, on anti-union laws and so on, where Starmer rarely speaks out. So they should be coordinating within the party now. And, you know, if they reach a point where they think it's untenable to stay in the party, I agree with you, they need to discuss that together and do it together. And, you know, if that time comes, form a political alternative, not just drift into the political wilderness.
Thank you very much, Pete. I think that was a very useful discussion, that it's not quite clear cut. Thank you for joining us. Jackie wants to come back now. Unfortunately, we couldn't get hold of Suresh Grover. He had agreed to speak about, you know, the attacks or, you know, Starmer's ignoring of ethnic minorities, but unfortunately we couldn't get hold of him now to come to the meeting. So Jackie, sort of perhaps in the context of the election success of Aspire in Tower Hamlets, which was very interesting, wasn't it? Lutfur Rahman had been dragged through the courts in what was quite clearly a stitch-up, electoral fraud, whatever. It was quite a stitch-up and quite a racist undertones to it. How do you see that scenario?
I think this is, in a way, for me, one of the most interesting things that's happening. I mean, if you look at recent polls of the Muslim community, it's suggesting something like they may well lose half of the Muslim vote. That in certain constituencies is really, really significant. And just like we've seen in Tower Hamlets, it can't be taken for granted that the Muslim vote won't just go, somewhere else. And the other thing I wanted to think about, I mean, Starmer's attitudes towards, what I would call the really oppressed minorities, we can see in like Trevor Phillips, and of course, how he responded to Black Lives Matter, when he then had he put himself into, I think, half a day's training to improve himself in terms of his attitude towards Black people. And then we saw the debacle as well of Batley and Spen, that kind of disaster there that happened. And I think we might well be seeing replications of that happening again and again. And who knows what's going to play out in the next election. But it strikes me that Labour is doing very well at attacking its own base at the moment, on the basis that somehow it's going to get the Conservative vote. I would suggest that what we've seen in the local elections is that all the kind of wavering Conservative votes who were going to have crossed over in that won't actually increase. And I suspect what you are also going to get is the Labour Party being outmaneuvered on a number of their offers. At that point, those votes are going to be very crucial. And I think it was extraordinary that what we saw was this lauding of what's called the Jewish community vote in Barnet, where, it was being applauded and being said that, isn't it wonderful now that the community has now crossed over and voted with us, although even that move was not very big. But when you see the Muslim community voting in a particular way, the Starmer supporters came out on social media, and the racist comments that were being said about that was really quite shocking. So I think there is a story still unfolding there.
So I think we had quite an interesting discussion. I mean, we had, unfortunately, Suresh Grover can't be here. That would have been a useful discussion to have. But I think it's important to discuss where the Labour Party is going. We don't quite actually know where it's going. What I think one of the key problems is for the left is that there's so little alternative outside of the Labour Party, which it doesn't inspire confidence that there is a movement that could take things forward. So without such a coherent alternative, a working class, socialist, Marxist alternative, it is very difficult to say to people, leave the Labour Party, because atomization, I think, does follow. So, if comrades can stay in the Labour Party and fight, not all of us are allowed, as somebody said in the programme, I would encourage comrades to continue to stay and fight and make life difficult for the right. Our next programme, in 2 weeks' time, will take place during the Jubilee Bonanza. Yay!
Off with their heads.
Question mark. Off with their heads.
Question mark.
That's the title of the program. Off with their heads, or do we just want to put them out of their misery?
Both could be true.
Allowing them to have a fully rounded, life as normal people. And we want to share a little teaser for 2 weeks' time, the program, which is something that occurred last week and I think was enjoyed by all.
course, I had thoughts, but I think in these situations, it's always the best to ask the question, why does it happen? So I know our people that well that they wouldn't do if there's no reason for it. The majority of our supporters are wonderful people, really smart and all these kind of things, understand, go through lows, go through highs, suffer together, all these kind of things. They wouldn't do it if there would not be a reason. That's what I know. And maybe we should ask this question.
That is the question we're going to be asking. Why are they booing?
Exactly, and it's not just because they're from Liverpool. I don't think.
No, it's not. But I do think it will actually be a nice break from all the nonsense we're going to hear on that weekend. So join us then. Off with their heads, yes or no. Good night.
Bye bye.